Regulation, friend or foe?
Good morning, Malta. Good morning, everybody. It's always a very special thing to be kind of the content opener of such a conference, and especially when you have to do it with such a dry topic as we are starting with, regulation. We can't avoid it. It either can be very help us to start innovation if it's done the right way, and on the other hand, very often it can save lives, but it also can be exactly the opposite. And so what is regulation? Is it friend or is it foe? And that's what we are here to discuss in this panel. And, well, I'm not sure, but I think we will try to make it a little bit more entertaining than just as a pure matter is suggesting. Well, yeah, I already said it's a very complex topic, and we can't avoid it. And regulation, in many cases, is very decades behind the actual development. Technology is developing rapidly, and regulators, well, especially in Europe, with all the instances that has to be, and stakeholders that have to be heard, things are very complex, and this too is a pain in our testicles, because we are, well, this was even worse, sorry. Because it provides a lot of insecurity, because we don't know what can we do in the future and what can we do now. Do we have to rethink things we have already launched? So things are very complex, and especially in the medical field, where you are really dealing with very sensitive data, and yeah, so how can we handle it, and how do we have to handle that? Yeah, you are a lawyer, and especially when we're talking about MedTech, there's a lot of difference between regulation in medicines and in medical devices. So why is this necessary, or what's the reason for that?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to share the panel with you. The basic question is whether we need or not regulation. Of course, light regulation is good for competition, is good for initiative, but we have to be able to know when we might have this light regulation, because we should acknowledge as well that in some cases heavy regulation, let's call it like that, is needed, and medicines is one of the cases. And why is that? Because in medicine, like in MedTech in general, what is at stake is too big, is too important. It's the health and the life of people. So it does not allow us to have under-regulated sector that would not be acceptable. And so we can pick the medical devices example, and we can know that it's a good example to discuss this regulating theme, because we come from, namely in the EU, from a context in which very few regulation was in place, and to a time when this regulation is now set up. Now, before I say why the innovation time is not the law time, let me tell you, give you two really brief examples of why under-regulated sector on the medical devices is dangerous. The first example is the PIP company, a French company, that was making breast implants using silicone, not medical silicone, but industrial silicone, that was spread through 400,000 women in the world. But this industrial silicone made the implants break up much more easily, from 5 to 10 times more, and with consequences much more severe. That was in 2010, and the problems with the 400,000 women stayed from after the company ended. The second example is the metal-to-metal hip implants. Contrary to the first example, because the first example was a crime thing, the metal-to-metal hip implants was not a case of crime. The question was that research came to understand that these kind of implants were 5 times more problematic in 10 years after the implant than the regular implants. The problem was there was no traceability of the devices, and so no way to do this. In the EU, the new regulation brings replies to this, namely the European database on medical devices that will be able to assess the problems with medical devices and traceability of the devices. So why is that the time of innovation is not the time of the law? Because the EU regulation started in 2008 when the European Commission asked the member states about this. They presented a proposal in 2012. In 2014, the European Parliament gave its opinion, and the Council discussed it until 2017, when it was approved to be enforced in 2020. So 9 years between the start of the discussion and the approval, and 12 years since the start of the discussion and the enforcement of the law. So innovation will be it's not able to cope with the time of the law.
Well, innovation is happening anyway, but if we're not getting it done right and properly, other markets that are quicker will just overhaul us. And I think that's one of the problems, especially in the EU, we are faced with. Well, Julian, you are on the regulator side, and only recently you added also the regulation of devices to your services. And what was the choice, and how can it done? Because the device sector is so much larger than the medicine sector.
Sorry. Thank you for the question. Thank you for being on the panel. The Malta Medicines Authority has been tasked with medical devices very recently, as of last year or the year before. As you were saying, and following the introduction on regulation given by Daniel, medical devices, the term that we use between regulators, between the member states, between the authorities between us, and we like to compare it to a jungle. It used to be a jungle with the directives. There was a lot of room of misinterpretation. There was a lot of room for different level of standards being implemented, unfortunately. And now with the regulation being put forward, we're mirroring the level of standard that there is with medicines. So the highest level of standard, because at the end of the day, like a medicine has an impact on the life or death of a patient, so too does a medical device. We're speaking about items that can last within a patient for 10, 15 years, like a hip implant, stents, cardiac prosthesis, etc. So these may have a very big impact on the patient. Now, what we as the authority have been seeing over the past couple of years in terms of the regulation that has been implemented just recently this year, and the next one that's coming next year or the year after, is the problem in terms of scale, in terms of trust and issue and scalability of devices. So devices, we're speaking about hundreds of thousands of devices realistically. They range from very minimal risk of a tongue depressor, a wheelchair, a stethoscope, to something like a CAT scan, something like an X-ray machine, as I said before, a stent, which if there's an issue with any of this, there may be misdiagnosis, or they may have life-altering effects for the patient. A very common, not common, the limelight now is on COVID. So medical devices in COVID are rapid antigen tests, which have been the forefront in terms of sensitivity and selectivity, have been a very big discussion. Masks, surgical gowns, etc. So what are the main issues in terms of regulation from a regulatory point of view, from a regulator's side? So what the regulation offers and provides is a strong framework that increases a lot of innate trust that the patient can have on a device. Because if the device is upholding this regulation, then at the back of their mind you're saying this device has been certified, this device has a basic level of trust that the patient can have with it. But the issue comes with, in terms of feasibility and scalability, in terms of timelines that the stakeholders are seeing, as opposed that the regulation imposes that stakeholders have to abide by. So there's, for example, for a product to be certified as a compliant medical device according to the standards in the regulation, it has to go through a third-party body called a notified body. So this notified body sees the technical documentation, sees the dossier, the clinical investigations, etc., and says, this device is actually in line, is up to par, is in line with the standards of this particular device. If it has standards of electronic components, it has certain standards. If it has implantables, it has certain standards. There's a list of standards. But the issue is this. With the previous directives, there are around 50 notified bodies. These are notified bodies these are third-party bodies that have very niche scope. So if you want to do certification for I don't know, a breast implant, for example, there are only one or two notified bodies. You won't have the range of 50 where you can choose from. Now with the new regulations, things have gone up. They have to be recertified, new notified bodies have to be issued. So the problem came that now there's a bottleneck of notified bodies. So the number has decreased to 24. The workload has increased because all these devices have to be recertified and rescaled, upscaled to the new regulation. But there aren't enough notified bodies to do the task. So we're seeing a lot of things that unfortunately either are being withdrawn or recalled from the market because they cannot make deadlines that the regulation imposes, or that they no longer see it as feasible in terms of an economic point of view to go through the process. Or we're seeing that a current deadline is 6 to 8 months, the current timeline to get a product certified once you manage to find a notified body. So still, if you have a device which was on the market under the old directives, under the regulations, it has to be recertified, and to get the process ongoing in time takes 6 to 8 months. So there's a lack, there may be a gap in market access for that device, which at the end of the day will affect the patient.
Well, actually, just a very quick sentence. Is the situation in Europe helpful for you? Or is it, or would you wish for something else?
No, currently in Europe, with the EU Commission's assistance, there's a very healthy and very good scenario and good outreach from the Commission side. In fact, as Daniel said, the regulation was to come out last year, but stakeholders said, listen, we won't be able to make the deadlines. Listen, there'll be a big market gap there. At the end of the day, the patient will suffer. So it was postponed by a year. It came out this year. The IVD regulation is due to come out in May next year. There's current discussion. There's been drafting of documentation to postpone it by another year. So it'll come out in the following year, the next year. So the European side, the European Commission is listening and is hearing the stakeholders and is hearing regulators, and it's taking action to actually waylay some of the risks that the regulation may pose.
Mm-hmm. Okay, because we're now moving to a completely different world, and we can't do without China, and China can't do without us, because the markets need each other's. But of course, the regulatory schemes are not really compatible, and so this is of course creating some trouble. And on the other hand, China is known as a fast mover. When we were talking about innovation before, they are the ones that are coming up with the innovation and bringing us under additional pressure. So how can we handle with it? And well, how is the situation in China compared to here, and how can we cope with it?
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question, and one that I surely could talk about longer than the time that we have.
Please don't.
I won't, I promise. First, regarding innovation, yes, as Daniel also said, innovation will always be faster than laws because it just takes some time. But something that I find very interesting in China, and that might be something that even if it cannot take over in Europe exactly the same, but that is something to consider, is even though they also are very heavy regulated, but if they want something, they can do it very fast. This is something that we seldom see here because it takes a long, long time to get new laws and so on. So in China, they have these sort of pilot zones and also sometimes some exams to rules to enable innovative companies to get their product on the market and to get them tested. For example, in southern China, in Hainan, they have a hospital, actually this is also interesting for foreign companies, which is allowed to import MedTech products without the very time-consuming licensing procedure that you normally need. So if they really need a certain innovative product that they don't produce in China themselves, they have ways to get it into the country, and this also then helps to make the license for the complete Chinese market easier if it has already been imported to Hainan. So this is actually, they have some sort of flexibility in this regard that we don't have. Of course, you always have to also be careful because you have to see that this also touches up in the safety, the security of the patients. So this is definitely something that you have to be careful with. Regarding dealing with the regulations in China, I guess most MedTech companies will have to do with China in one way or the other. Either you are sourcing some parts in China, or you want to, or are already selling products in China. So actually there is no way, as you probably all know, to go around this. You will have to get familiar with the regulations, and if you're, for example, having some new innovative product or are developing it, you should from the very beginning consider regulations in China if you plan to sell it there, because regulation in China is very heavy and you will have to do a lot of homework to get familiar with it. Also in China, a lot of things still depend on your contact, on your relationship with authorities that are responsible for it. And with China, you always have this culture and language problems, let's call it problems. As most of the new regulations, there will only be a Chinese version. So what we normally suggest is you need to have a partner who helps you to know the actual regulations, as they're also changing very fast sometimes, as I already mentioned, and you need somebody to be on your side to tell you, okay, there is a new regulation, and so that you can, in your development process, already take that, pay attention to it, and consider how to do these things. Yeah.
Well, time really is flying, so I really have to, all the things we have been thinking about that we could talk about. But I think an important issue is to talk about reliability, and let's combine it with trust, because I think that is one side or two sides of the same metal. I think reliability is extremely important because people need the security and know that what they can do in the future. And trust, of course, is important. We see it now with the COVID vaccination, people not trusting it because it was developed so fast. And this is creating the problems of getting enough people vaccinated. It's okay, for MedTech it's a different issue, but how can we bring these two issues together? And since we are running out of time already, please try to be as pointed as possible.
All right. Let's use an example to highlight this topic. So as I said before, rapid antigen tests are very much in the limelight at this point in time. So the level of trust and reliability as opposed to certification may not always reflect. So for example, under the old directives, to get a rapid antigen test onto the market, it was self-certification. So what does this mean? It means that the manufacturer creates the device, he creates it according to the standards, all right? And this says, he creates a documentation saying, I hereby declare that this device is adhering to these following standards, and this is up to par, up to scratch, to what needs to be done for this current directive that is in place. And they put it to market. What does this mean? So this means that there are a number of products on the market, but the end result that the product provides would be different. So we are seeing rapid antigen test rats that had 70% sensitivity to the COVID virus, as opposed to very high-end rapid antigen tests that had 98, 96, very high numbers of percentage of sensitivity and selectivity. In terms of the directive, in terms of the regulations of certification, you would see the CE mark, as everyone knows the CE mark is certification for medical devices. They would both be certified. They are both in line with the regulations at that point in time, at the current directives. But so the term of trust, it may be misleading that when one sees the CE marking, there is a level of trust that can be put into the device. Because a 70% chance that you get a false negative, not sure, sorry, a 70% chance selectivity, so there's 30% chance that you get a false negative, is a very high risk, in my opinion. In fact, in Malta, we do not accept anything in terms of, we have done a list of what we accept in terms of rapid antigen tests that we see in the Maltese market, and we only accept those that have a very high percentage of 96 and above. So there's a level of trust that the directive did not implement, we implemented ourselves. Now, with the new regulations going forward, this level of trust, a patient, a lay user may put more peace of mind, may have more peace of mind on the level of CE marking, because the standards now have gone from what I said before, a jungle, to a very highly regularized, highly standardized situation where the CE mark between a product, a very high-end product, and the lowest end product would no longer result in that same gap. It's a very small gap now.
So the gap, of course, between trust and reliability, how do you work with it on the legal side? Are you compliant with what the regulator is saying? But very short, please.
Yes, of course. Concerning regulation, I would like to highlight a point, is that law is only one of the issues that promotes regulation. And sometimes we just stick to the law only, or get limited by the law, but that's only one part of what regulates what we are doing and what MedTechs are doing and startups are doing. And namely, if you are on the digital side, you have to understand that there are other issues that regulate maybe more than the law in the first instance. If you are in the digital, probably architecture, so the code will limit you more than the law. As Lawrence Lessig puts it, code is law. And so sometimes we just stay focused too much on the law. And it's important that we have this discussion here, because as long as we have the discussion if regulation is important or not, lawyers have a work to do, and that's a good thing.
Okay, trust and reliability. When it comes to China, I think here in Europe we have an increasing problem with that. Can you ease our fears, or would you rather pour oil into the flame?
I I think I won't be able to ease your fears because Chinese regulators are recently very heavily regulating MedTech, and they have a plan to be a leading country in MedTech, I think in 2025 already. So actually, also their regulation might sometimes seem very biased, and all the procedures might be harder actually for foreign companies. So to sell in China or to go to the market in China always needs to be considered very carefully, and the trust that you can put into the Chinese government is definitely not as high as you could, for example, put into a European government, I guess.
Well, that's not really a good perspective. So, last round, one word, one sentence at the most. What is regulation to you, friend or foe?
I think regulation may start as a foe, but will eventually end as a friend, because there may be initial upkeep and upfront costs, but at the end of the day, it's all in the favor of the patient and the end user.
Mareike?
Yeah, definitely friend. And if it's not your friend yet, you should make it your friend.
And Daniel?
Yeah, more than the answer, I'm worried about the discussion. Just keep the discussion, because that's important for what I do.
Well, what I learned, but it was nothing new really, is that we are this is a very difficult situation, and it's both friend and foe, depending on what side you take. Thank you to the panel, and yes, and you all. I wish you a very successful 2 days of MedTech conference.